Alright, we're starting out Unit 4 of General Biology with Chapter 6, talking about photosynthesis. Unit 4 is going to be all about plants, with a little bit at the end about fungi as well. Chapter 6 talks about photosynthesis. We skipped Chapter 6 earlier this semester when we were talking about energy in Unit 2, because I just feel like this chapter fits in better with what we're talking about as we learn about plants. A couple important things about photosynthesis. We call creatures that can perform photosynthesis, we call them producers. And what that refers to is that they are the organisms on the planet Earth that feed everybody else, because they have the unique ability to transform solar energy, which is the root of all the energy in our biosphere. They can transform solar energy into chemical energy. They primarily do that by making glucose or other carbohydrates. Plants aren't the only creatures that can do this. Algae and cyanobacteria can do this as well. We're not going to talk too much in this semester about algae and cyanobacteria, though. Okay, we're going to talk for a couple of slides here about the chemistry of photosynthesis, the chemical reaction that is photosynthesis. But first I want to relate this a little bit to the anatomy of the plant. So in a typical plant, we're going to see some other types of arrangements as well by the time we're done talking about plants. But in the typical plant, we have a big broad portion here, often green, that we call the leaf. And in the bottom of the leaf, so if we zoom in, we're zooming in on this little cross section here of a leaf. If we look at this cross section, there's some empty space in the leaf, and at the bottom of the leaf there's a small pore called a stoma, or the plural of stoma would be stomata. That's how plants breathe. So we're going to see that gas, carbon dioxide, is needed for photosynthesis. A waste product, oxygen, is also produced by photosynthesis. And these stoma are kind of like our mouths and nose. They are the place where gases can enter and leave the plant. Photosynthesis also requires water, and most of the water from a plant enters through the roots, through soil, and travels up into the leaf. So the two necessary chemicals that are needed for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water, and now we know how those enter. The cells that are primarily responsible for photosynthesis, we see the term here pointing at these green cells, a lot of them at the top of the leaf where they're exposed to a lot of sun. Those cells are called the mesophyll cells. And they are green because they possess many chloroplasts. That's the little cartoon that we're seeing here, these chloroplasts. This is what these cells look like under a microscope. And this might look familiar to you from cells that you've already seen this semester. The small green circles here within each cell are the chloroplasts. Mesophils have many chloroplasts. These are the little organelles within the cell that can perform photosynthesis. So now you know a little bit about the anatomy of the plant, just a little bit, and the cells that perform photosynthesis, the mesophyll cells, and the parts of those mesophyll cells that perform photosynthesis, which are the chloroplasts. Diving deeper into the structure, here are a couple of important things you should know about chloroplasts. Okay, so here again we're going to refer to this cartoon here because we can see a little bit more detail than we can with just these little green circles here. This is a double membrane organelle. Maybe that reminds you of another double membrane organelle we learned about, the mitochondria. And also hopefully reminds you about something that we learned about the mitochondria and chloroplast, which are the fact that these two organelles, we think, actually were standalone prokaryotic organisms that were engulfed by eukaryotes long time back, probably over 1 billion years ago. And so these chloroplasts actually have some of the remnants of being their own cells, their own bacteria. They have bacterial-like DNA and bacterial ribosomes within them, just like mitochondria have those structures. Okay, so that's a little bit about where these chloroplasts came from. Let's look deeper now. the chloroplasts look like when we see really high definition pictures like this one here or these cartoons. Looks like there's stacks of green flattened coins. Those green coins are called the thylakoids. They are very important in the absorption of light. We'll see a little bit more about those later in this chapter. And then between the stacks of thylakoids, and by the way, just so you're familiar with the term, a granum is a stack of these thylakoids. I usually don't use that word very much, but just in case you run into it, now you know. In between these stacks of thylakoids is a gel called the stroma. And that's an important part of the chloroplast as well, because a lot of chemical reactions happen in the stroma. Lots of enzymes there. So from what you should be taking away primarily from this would be the thylakoids as one important part of the chloroplast and the stroma from the other. Pay special attention to wording here. Stroma is the gel here inside the chloroplast. Stoma, we talked about in a previous slide, is the pore. So it's unfortunate those words are so similar, but pay special attention to stoma versus stroma. They are very different things. Alright, basic chemistry here of the photosynthetic process. This is a chemical reaction I would expect you to know. The two reactants here are water and carbon dioxide. The two products are, it says here, CH2O. That's the generic formula for a carbohydrate. And then oxygen is a waste product. This product is completely energized by light. Light could be from the sun, most of it is. I guess we could also think about artificial lights. That's providing the energy for this reaction. I'm hoping that the general structure of this chemical reaction looks a little familiar to you, because when we learned about cellular respiration way back in chapter 7, we talked about carbohydrates and oxygen reacting to form water and carbon dioxide. So the exact flip-flop of this reaction is what we call cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is in essence cellular respiration backwards. Hoping that you also recognize terms like oxidation and reduction. When something is reduced, it means it's gaining electrons and hydrogens. So in this case, carbon is being reduced. It's gaining hydrogens and electrons to form carbohydrates. In maybe an informal biological chemistry way, we could think of reduction as a building up reaction. In this case, oxygen is being oxidized. It's losing electrons and hydrogens, and we can tell that because it's got hydrogens here as water. When it's oxidized, it's lost hydrogens. Easier, or a little bit harder to tell, it's also lost electrons. Oxidation usually means a breakdown reaction. Just like cellular respiration had three major reactions: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. Hopefully those terms still sound a little familiar to you. Photosynthesis has a couple of major groups of reactions as well. So in the coming videos, we're going to talk about the light reactions. That's what's happening here in the thylakoids, and they're called the light reactions because these are the reactions that require light energy or solar energy to happen. And then we're also going to talk about a set of reactions called the Kelvin cycle. In history, in older textbooks, they used to call that the dark reactions because they don't require light to happen. But I guess we've decided that's kind of a misleading term because they certainly can happen. They don't have to be in the dark. So they've gone back to calling this the light independent cycle or the Kelvin cycle. So we're going to go through those in a lot of detail. Notice here in our little cartoon of the chloroplast, the light reactions are happening in the thylakoids. The Kelvin cycle is happening in the stroma, the gel between the thylakoids. just a little bit of the physics background behind light so we can understand what we mean by light causing photosynthesis. This whole spectrum here of different waves of energy, that's called the electromagnetic spectrum. You might have heard about that in other science classes. And shorter wavelength light, the shorter the wavelength, the more energy those rays have. Longer wavelengths have less energy. So we see here on the very high energy end, or short wavelength end, things like gamma rays and X-rays, which can be quite harmful to living things, or even ultraviolet light. We can't see that, but it is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then on the lower energy side here, infrared, microwaves, or even radio waves are actually forms of electromagnetic radiation. There's a tiny little bit here between UV and infrared that is called the visible light spectrum. So if we zoom way out here, we can see the 380 to 750 that this is measuring. Don't memorize those numbers, by the way. That is the wavelength of light, and the way that we see this with our eyes is that in that 380 to 400 nanometer portion of wavelength, we see that as purple or violet. Lower wavelength, around the 700, 750, we see that as red. How does this relate to anything that we're talking about? Well, when something appears to have a color to our own eyes, for example, when we see a green leaf, what we are really seeing is all the light that that green leaf is not absorbing. So if we're out in the sun, and this sunlight contains all the colors of the electromagnetic spectrum, when all the colors are present, we tend to see it as whitish. When that light hits leaves and we see it as green, that means that our eyes are seeing the light that's not absorbed, which is in this case green. That means everything but green light is being absorbed. That means that this leaf is actually pulling energy, or soaking energy up, if you will, from the electromagnetic spectrum. It does that because of molecules that absorb light called pigments. You have pigments probably in your clothes that you're wearing right now. If you are wearing clothes that appear red, that means the pigments in your clothes are absorbing everything but red. If this leaf appears green, it's because it has a lot of pigment molecules called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll molecules absorb everything but green, so they appear green to our eye. That is the basis for photosynthesis. The pigment molecules absorb sunlight, absorb energy from the electromagnetic spectrum, and they're able to convert that to chemical energy. Now in the fall, you probably noticed that leaves lose their primarily green color, at least around Wisconsin, Michigan, and they might appear for a short time as they're dying to be yellow or red. That's because leaves actually contain all year round other pigments as well, not just chlorophyll. They also contain molecules called carotenoids, which are yellow or orange, or some forms of them are more reddish. Those absorb all the colors except for the ones that they appear. So in this goldish leaf here is absorbing everything but gold light. It's helpful for plants to have more than one color pigment, even if their primary pigment most of the year is green. Having underlying other pigments as well means they can absorb as much light as possible. And you can imagine the more light they absorb, the more energy they have to do photosynthesis. In the next video, we're going to dive deeper into the light and Kelvin cycle reactions of photosynthesis.